What started as protests for George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and Rayshard Brooks has led to new calls for police reform and an end to police brutality in South Florida. From banning chokeholds to reform measures aimed at rooting out police misconduct. This has been a summer of change. When it comes to police accountability, how much has been changed and what else needs to be done?
Hey guys, I am Jermel Pridgeon. I am the social media editor for NBC6 South Florida. Welcome to our Voices live stream for tonight. We are waiting for Jowan Strader to get in. We seem to be having a little bit of technical difficulties, but we are so excited for you to join us this evening. You can answer or ask any questions that you want to. Panelists, we are talking about police accountability this evening. So if you just give us a few moments, Jowan Strader, NBC6 anchor, will be right with us, and he is joining us right now. So I am pulling Jowan into the live stream and taking myself out. You can take it over.
All right, thank you so much, Jermel. I really appreciate that. Amazing. You got to love technology, right? Well, good evening and welcome to our virtual NBC6 Voices and Facebook and YouTube pages. I am Jowan Strader. I apologize for that little technical difficulty that we had right there. Well, in the wake of George Floyd's death, cities across South Florida are grappling with how to reform their police departments to hold officers accountable and to prevent violence against Black communities. Well, we've got an incredible panel, as you can see, joining us for this great conversation this evening. First, we have Stanley Jean-Poix. He is the president of the Miami Community Police Benevolent Association. Joining Stanley is Donald Jones, a professor at the University of Miami Law School. Also, Professor Jones teaches constitutional law and critical race theory. Yeah. And you may recognize LaToya Ratlieff. Fort Lauderdale police shot her in the face with a foam rubber bullet at a George Floyd protest back in May. And we want to welcome all of our panelists. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you for having me here.
Well, LaToya, first, let's start off with you. How are you doing? How are you feeling?
I'm better. It's a bit of a process. I still have ongoing doctor's appointments. Still haven't regained my vision fully. So just being patient and just hopeful that things will get better.
And you fractured your eye socket?
Yes, it was a cranial fracture, and then I had to have 20 stitches as well.
My goodness. My goodness. Well, it's good to see you and so good to hear about your recovery. And we really appreciate you joining us for this conversation. All right. Well, let's go ahead and start off with you, Stanley. Let's talk about some of the changes that have been made and what more needs to be done. So you recently were outspoken against Miami Police Chief George Floyd recently over the use of the N-word 2 decades ago. Now, the chief claimed that it was part of a training and said that he even gave a warning before the class. We're not going to get into that discussion so much, but we want to talk about what has been done and what needs to be done. So are you seeing enough done as far as police accountability is concerned within the city of Miami Police Department since the incident involving George Floyd?
I mean, you know, I've seen the chief go on TV and he's met with some community leaders. But as for our organization, we met with the city manager back on June 19th. We're scheduled to meet back with him in the beginning of August. So at that point, I'll be able to tell you, you know, at a future date, what has been done. But at this point, I really don't know if anything has been done or not.
What more do you believe needs to be done?
I mean, I think it's a matter of speaking to, for instance, us as an organization and the community, hearing what our concerns are, and validating the community, especially the Black community. You know, you have to understand, as a people, we're hurting. You know, we demand to be respected. We're tired of being treated as second-class citizens. You know, we're taxpayers too, and we deserve professional police service.
Now, you do have a CIP within the city of Miami. It's something that Miami-Dade County does not have, but you do. Do you believe that that's a start, even though there are other issues happening within the City of Miami Police Department that you see?
I think it's a start. However, as you know, the CIP doesn't have subpoena powers at this moment. So, for instance, as an officer, if you summons me to come to the CIP and give a statement, because you can't subpoena me, I don't have to show up, and there are no repercussions for that at this moment. And so it's there, but it's like a toothless tiger.
Now, earlier I spoke with Miami-Dade Commissioner Barbara Jordan and got her thoughts on police accountability in Miami-Dade County. Take a listen. Are you pleased with some of the actions that are being taken as far as in regards to making sure there is police accountability?
I am very pleased with our director. We have a new director. He was just appointed in the last few months, but he is a person who can be trusted, and he takes swift action. If you saw the incident that occurred at the airport with one of the officers striking a citizen, to me, the citizen was extremely rude and out of line. And that officer had every right to right then and there, when she got up in his face, to say, okay, madam, just take her by the hand and arrest her and handcuff her. She was definitely out of order. But the fact that he used his hand to give an open slap was just absolutely horrible. And of course, our director took immediate action, and that officer, after 20 years of being on the force, was relieved of duty and later fired within the day. So I have seen him in the last few incidences that have occurred take swift and immediate action. Now, I know that probably doesn't bode well with a number of his officers, but at least he has the courage to do what's right.
All right, Professor Jones, I want to pivot to you because you are a constitutional law professor. You speak about these issues quite a bit. Matter of fact, back in 2010, between 2010 and 2013, you worked with the ACLU Fort Lauderdale. And in Fort Lauderdale, they were dealing with issues of basically cycling while black, where black cyclists were receiving a number of citations from the police department. You worked with the ACLU back then. I want your thoughts on what's being done in the county and here in South Florida as far as accountability is concerned.
Well, I mean, first of all, I think one of the things you have to understand is that the way that we have policed in the city, particularly in the inner city, has been one in which it's followed a model, what we call crime control, in which instead of focusing on individual rights, or much less the power of the community to control the police, what we focused on is giving the police more power, thinking that's going to make us safer. And I don't think that's happened. I think what's happened is that the most vulnerable populations see discretion being abused. In Fort Lauderdale, what you had a group of people who were being cited for something like riding a bicycle without a driver's registration, riding your bicycle without a driver's registration. And this is part of this so-called community policing. What it is, it's the police engaging in hyper-aggressive activity, thinking that this is somehow going to reduce crime. What it does is it arrests people unnecessarily. No one should get arrested simply for riding a bicycle without a registration. And these are things that were happening to communities of people who are particularly black and poor. And so this is wrong. We've got to rethink the whole concept of how we police, reimagine what policing should be. It should be one where we have a one-to-one relationship with the citizens. I would love to see, for example, the community deciding, making decisions, participating in decisions about who polices them. Should it be someone who has to live in their neighborhood? Should the police have to use guns? And how are they deployed? Are they going to go after people who are riding their bicycle without a registration, or are they going to go after people who commit violent crimes? So we need to give people power to make decisions instead of this from City Hall down. Put the local community in a position of power to make decisions that's going to protect them, so the police will protect and serve rather than search and destroy.
So what you're seeing, though, as of right now, since the death of George Floyd, are you seeing enough as far as accountability is concerned with some of the changes that are taking place? And I mean, being a constitutional law professor, it takes time. It's not something that's really done overnight, but there have been some things that have been done.
Well, I think we're getting incrementalism. I think that there are incremental changes. There's big rhetoric and incremental changes. But we really we're really at a crossroads. We have to make big changes. I want to see changes not merely in procedures, but in structures. Who controls the police? I want to see that. I want to see people in charge. Also want to see things enforced. So, for example, let's say you have a rule that you don't chase someone in an open parking lot with a gun unless that person is threatening someone. I want to see those rules enforced. I want to see people, actually, it's a question of leadership. Make sure that if you have a rule, it's actually enforced. You don't just have a person with 16 violations. Someone called me, a reporter said, well, there are these cops who had made violation after violation, and they're still retained violation after violation, and they still have a gun. We have to change that. There has to be real accountability, not just on paper.
And someone who has been pushing for that change is LaToya Ratlieff, who joins us now with more. And LaToya, you were a witness who testified before the House Subcommittee on Violence Against Protesters. Something you said, and it really, I guess, kind of pretty said it all. And you said, quote, "We need our elected leaders to use this moment in history to enact reforms which make our systems of justice truly equal and to hold those to whom we grant power accountable when they abuse it." Do you see this happening?
Honestly, no. I do think there are, as we look across the country, there's examples where you see that there are cities or states that are moving towards progress, that are working collectively with the community to address the issue. But if you think about overall, the majority of our country and where we are, and even specifically in South Florida, we still have a lot more to go. And I don't sometimes feel like was mentioned before, I don't think there's a lot of citizens input. I don't, especially when you have a significant amount of community organizations that have been on the ground, that have a direct connection to the Black community. I don't know how often their voices are being heard.
And I know you listed a few ideas that you gave when you testified. Also, the Fort Lauderdale police chief was recently removed. So do you believe that this is somewhat a step forward as to some of the changes as they try to move more towards accountability?
I would like to think so, but honestly, I just feel like it was needed. Beyond the accountability for what happened to me, the subsequent actions of some of the police officers, the releasing of the video where the officers were celebrating shooting the citizens, basically, and asking about their camera being on, and then his response to that, and not necessarily taking accountability and condemning the officers for doing so. I think it was needed either way, regardless of if they are being open to this reform. It was just something that should have happened, because he didn't seem like he was ready to be responsible for the progression and for what the community is asking for.
And you're talking about reform. So going back to the CIP, something that Miami-Dade County Commissioner Barbara Jordan, she is trying to push for there in Miami-Dade County, but recently it was vetoed by Miami-Dade County Mayor Carlos Jimenez. Here's what she had to say about that. So I don't understand what this holdup and the politics is all about. I really don't, because it seems like there is a need here in the county for that. We see it in the city.
Absolutely. We have it in the city. We have it in several states throughout the country. And they have subpoena power. And when I called the city of Miami to find out how effective their subpoena power had been over the years, in the last 9 years, they've only used it once in 9 years to call a witness that was a city employee. So it's the threat of using it that would make people respond, because they don't want to be subpoenaed, so they will voluntarily come in. And I think that just having it as a tool gives us much more leverage But we still have it as a tool, but not as strong as I would have wanted it to be if it passes.
So I want to ask my two experts, because I have a professor here with constitutional law, and also Stanley, I want to ask you, is it important to have that subpoena power if you are trying to investigate something that may have been wrong when it comes to law enforcement and the citizens?
Yeah, most definitely, because then that will force the officer to have to come in and be accountable. I think as a law enforcement officer, where the dilemma comes in, we have something also called internal affairs. So their job is to investigate officers' wrongdoings. And so where the dilemma may come in is you go to internal affairs, and when you're talking about officers' bill of rights, and you don't want to double jeopardy, you go into a CIP panel and you give a statement. And let's say you go into internal affairs and you give a different statement, you can have problems as an officer. And I think, that's why officers don't want to go to a CIP and make a statement. But for it to be effective, you're going to have to be able to subpoena those officers.
So, Professor Jones, I want to ask you, well, without the subpoena power, is it just pretty much a watered down?
Yes.
Pretty much, because listen, you want a CIP there for oversight.
Yeah.
And it's like, so if you don't have that subpoena power, is it going to be as powerful?
Well, you see, one of the things we've encountered is a culture of silence. The shields lock, figuratively. No one is going to say anything. And if you don't have subpoena power, how are you going to get the documents? How are you going to get the people come forward? They can come, not come, and so it becomes an informal process, which has absolutely no meaning. The only meaning is that there's this on paper review board which has no ability to accomplish anything. And we're up against a culture of silence. We're up against an organization that typically functions as a sovereign state. That's not democracy. We need democracy, and the subpoena power would be a small step forward. Now, I think that there's several other things I could suggest, but that's just one of the smallest, most logical, most necessary that just must be done.
I just don't understand why someone would try to fight that, because it would be watered down. I just can't understand that, pretty much. And LaToya, I wanted to ask you, when you hear about things like a CIP, in Miami, in the city of Miami, they don't have it in Miami-Dade County. Of course, as you just heard from the commissioner, she is pushing for that, and she hopes that it's in place by the end of the year. But I wanted to ask your thoughts about a CIP in every county, in every city. Is this just one of the things that you believe needs to be done in order for there to be accountability within police departments across the country?
Absolutely. I advocate for having a CIP in each county. I think it's important, as Professor Jones mentioned, to have the citizen involved and a part of the process. And it's important to have a fair and balanced review of officers' actions. So that if that means having citizens involved as well, perhaps having a retired police officer that's on the review panel so that they can provide some subjective information from a law enforcement background as well. But I do think it's important to have that input.
And Stanley, I want to ask you, what do you believe is probably one of the most important things that needs to be done as far as change is concerned within the departments, not only Miami, but other departments across the country that you don't see now?
For instance, some departments don't invest a lot into community policing. One thing I have to give my department credit in, we have what we call, we spend a lot of time with community policing. We have what we call the Miami Police Athletic League, which works with the youth in the community, at-risk youth. And, we want to establish a relationship with them as they get older. They have an appreciation for police, and that allows you to have an appreciation for the community. But what happens is when you don't see community policing, it becomes a us versus them mentality. It becomes more like an occupying army, and, we just trust in ourselves, and the community is the enemy. And so the community doesn't know you. You don't know the community. You just go out there and patrol, and you finish your shift and you go home. So I think they need to do a lot more with community policing. And you have things, for instance, like Department of Justice. If you have issues, you can file with Civil Rights Division. You have consent decrees when it comes to hiring and firing, promotions, things of that nature. Those are just some of the ideas that other departments can work on. I know the city of Miami is pretty good at that, but other departments can use that. And
I have to ask you about defunding the police. And LaToya, I have to ask you the same question, because that has been floating around. We see the president is using that in a lot of his campaign ads against presumptive Democratic nominee Joe Biden. So I wanted to ask you about defunding the police, because, of course, we're talking about, a lot of people are talking about basically moving funds more so to the community, not basically doing away with the police. And then some are talking about doing away with the police. What are your thoughts on that, LaToya?
I think the defunding is just it's a shock term. And I do, as you mentioned before, for the most part, it is about reallocating money to other possibly new departments within the law enforcement that would be able to handle nonviolent crimes. I don't think that's something that can't be done. I don't think that's something that people should be fearful of. It would be having departments that are trained, that are able to go out and handle, especially when you think about homelessness. And we start to see, especially sometimes here in South Florida, there's this criminalization aspect of being homeless, when we should be able to help them to come out and bring them the safety or bring them food. But I do think when we're talking about removing policing entirely, that, that's something that we shouldn't look to, because we do need the police, but we also need the police to be available to handle crimes that are best suited for police, and potentially have departments that can come in and help the community in other ways.
Well, Stanley, you were just talking about some of the community policing that needs to be done more so. So when you talk about reallocating some of those funds, does that take away some of the points that you made as far as some of those things that need to be done?
Well, in policing, it's usually a either or. Okay, we put more money into community policing, or do we spend it in technology and hiring more police officers, training, education? And so the department, I believe, like Ms. Ratlieff said earlier, you need to work with the community and see what's important to them, and you put your resources there. And so, we have something where we have net commanders, where the city's divided into 13 net areas or sections, and they have a commander, and they try to meet with the community and find out what their needs are, and we try to put more emphasis on that. I'll give you a perfect example. Years ago, back in, I think, 2009, we had a former Chief Exposito came in, and what he did was he took money away from the PAL program and things like that and spent it more in technology. And you know what happened? We had a series of black males getting shot in the community. And so the Department of Justice had to come back in and place oversight over the city of Miami. And so the following Chief Rosa, came back. He put officers back on the street, foot patrol. He put a lot of emphasis with community policing, the Police Athletic League, and it seemed to work for the city of Miami. So that's just one example.
And Professor Jones, I want to get you in on this conversation as well from a legal standpoint when it comes to, quote, defunding the police.
Yes.
What does that look like from a legal standpoint? Well,
first of all, I don't think that anyone would literally want to defund the police. If you did take the money away, first of all, the people who are the wealthiest would say, fine, we'll hire our own private police. And the people who wouldn't have them would be the poorest people who need them the most. In the Black community, one of the problems we have is violence is a real, look at Chicago, look at New York, it is a real problem. So we need police. What we don't need is abuse of discretion. And I think that's where I wanted to re-emphasize the need for real change to create community control, local control of, but it's more than that too. Police need clear rules and regulations. One of the things you see, for example, in Rashard Brooks' case, is that they should have a regulation that says, unless a person has a gun, you don't pull your weapon and so forth. The fact that he may have a stick or a taser that's not operable isn't enough. So they need clear rules, clear standards. Then you need accountability, leadership that actually imposes those standards, doesn't let people off with a slap on the hand. And you need community control of police. But with no one, I think, could literally mean defund the police. I think all they could mean is there's a militarization that's taken place. There's a hyper aggressiveness that we constantly see. They want an end to the militarization. They want an end to the hyper aggressiveness, and they want to see if we can transfer funds to some of the problems like social work rather than incarceration. But the bottom line is we need massive investment in the community to deal with the root causes. After we deal with that, then we deal with the problem of crime and so forth. But first, massive investment. And if we could, that's the root cause. And then if we're dealing with police, then let's talk about making sure they have clear rules, make sure there's leadership that holds them accountable for everything. And let's give people in the community decisions about what does community policing mean? Do they live in that community? Should they even have guns? So we need to rethink and reimagine the community justice, the criminal justice system. And while we're at it, reimagine the Black community and inner city as a place where there are real opportunities and real jobs.
And with that said, LaToya, I want to ask you, where do we go from here? Where do we go from here? And there's small steps being taken, but is it enough right now?
Oh, that's a good question. As you mentioned, and specifically, Professor Jones spoke about incremental changes. And I think we've had too many times for incremental changes. I think throughout our country over the last few decades, we've seen these incremental changes, and we've seen things basically go back to where they were before and sometimes worse. And until there is national attention, until collectively, especially from the top, our leadership, we address the issue head on, I don't know what's going to happen. But for sure, this should be a national issue. I speak a lot about referring to this as a Black community problem when it really is an American problem. This is an American issue that has existed for far too long. So we need the leadership, our leaders locally, our leaders nationally, to address this issue because it's affecting too many of us.
And Stanley, I want to ask you before we go too, I want to ask you the question because you said at a press conference recently when you were addressing the comments made by your chief of police, you said that for far too long that many Black police officers in Miami have been ignored for years, So with that said, do you still believe that you're being ignored? Do you believe that you're being heard since the death of George Floyd?
Like I said before, because we're going to meet with the city manager in August, so it's hard for me to answer that, because we haven't, we met briefly and he said he'd get back to us. I hope that, there's a change and I hope it gets better. So at this moment, I would say we're still at a standstill. And one thing I would like to say, people don't look at the Black officers as part of the community, but we come from the communities. We grew up in the Black community. When we're out of uniform, we experience the same things that Black people experience. And so when the police department ignores us or mistreats us, if they do that to us, and we went to the academy with the officers, we trained together. And so if we get mistreated, then that means the Black community is in trouble. If they don't respect the Black officers in the department.
Amen, which means that we need you. Stanley Jean-Poix, thank you so much for joining us on the panel. Professor Donald Jones, thank you for your insight. LaToya Ratlieff, I am a big fan of yours. Thank you so much. And we wish you nothing but the best in your recovery with everything. And we want to thank everyone out there for tuning in as well. I want to make sure that we touch on something very important here finally tonight. A tribute to two pillars of the civil rights movement that we lost last week. The Reverend C.T. Vivian and Congressman John Lewis both died last Friday. Both men had strong ties to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the fight for freedom and voting rights that made national headlines 55 years ago in Selma, Alabama. That's our time for tonight, but we want to pay tribute to two pillars in the civil rights movement and their other contributions. Have a good night.
God bless.
Good night. Thank you.
The Reverend C.T. Vivian was very active in sit-in protests at an early age and went on to become an active early member for the group that eventually became the Southern Christian Leadership Conference with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who called Vivian one of the greatest preachers he had ever heard. He remained an advocate for justice and equality until his later years. Like Dr. King, Vivian was committed to the belief of nonviolent protest. Vivian participated in the Freedom Rides in Mississippi and was a close ally of Dr. King. Reverend Al Sharpton said Vivian, quote, made this nation and world a better place. In 2013, President Barack Obama awarded Vivian the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Reverend C.T. Vivian died at his home in Atlanta last week. He was 95. And a friend of Vivian, Congressman John Lewis, the sharecropper's son who became a giant of the civil rights movement and was known affectionately as the Conscience of Congress, passed away Friday following his battle with pancreatic cancer. Lewis was one of the original Freedom Riders. At 23, as one of the Big Six, he helped organize the March on Washington. And at just 23, he was the youngest speaker at the march. Lewis's battle for equality didn't stop there. He later took his battle for civil rights to the halls of Congress, where he served for more than 3 decades, in addition to educating and motivating the youth of our country.
And I said to all of the young people, you must get out there and push and pull and make America what America should be for all of us.
John Lewis was 80 years old.